I've been animating in Clip Studio Paint since 2018, and I'm convinced the timeline is one of the biggest reasons people give up on this software. And honestly, I get it. The timeline is confusing. But it's not because it's badly designed, it's because nobody ever actually explains how it works. They just show you where the buttons are and expect you to figure out the rest. And honestly, even some of my past tutorials are guilty of doing the same thing. So in this video, I'm going to show you the 4 things that I learned about the Clip Studio timeline that took me way too long to understand. And once you know them, animating in Clip Studio gets so much easier. For transparency's sake, I am using Clip Studio Paint EX, but a lot of these tips and tricks also apply to Clip Studio Pro. And if you're someone who's struggling with Clip Studio animation and want more tips like this in the future, consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where I'm actually making an indie anime using this exact software. Links are in the description. Alright, let's get into it. So, to address the elephant in the room, yes, my setup does not look the same as yours. I did customize my workspace to make things more efficient for myself. So for instance, you can see that my Clip Studio timeline probably does not look like yours. You probably have these white squares, or you have some sort of like image preview of your animation. This is because I adjusted the thumbnail preview size. So if you click on the hamburger horizontal line type thing here next to the timeline, go to thumbnail size, you can actually adjust the thumbnail here. So I'm going to choose large, and you can see that this is probably what your CSP timeline looks like. But for me, because I want to utilize as much of the space as possible, I actually just remove the thumbnail altogether, and I'm left with the individual numbers and lines here. It makes it so much easier to keep track on such a large timeline. And if you are somehow one of those people that did not actually know how to find your timeline and it's not pinned to the bottom, all you do is go up to the top, click Window, and then look for Timeline. Click on it and it should show up at the bottom. Alright, so the first thing that nobody really explains is the difference between using a single layer for your cells versus using a folder for your cell, and more importantly, how to use them efficiently. So if you're coming from a traditional drawing program, you're probably used to just drawing directly on a single layer. And yeah, you can definitely do that in Clip Studio. But if you're someone who likes to work with multiple layers, like having your line art separate from your colors, that approach is going to make your life way harder than it needs to be. Here's what I mean. So let's say we have a new animation layer, and I'm just going to create a bunch of single layer cells on the timeline. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's actually hide these so it's not as distracting. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see in the layers panel that these are just individual single layers. So let's say I do a scribble like this for cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, cell 4, cell 5. This is typically what you would see as you're scrubbing through the timeline. Each of these cells and keyframes represent one single layer in your layers panel. But I'll bet you didn't know that you can actually set a folder in your layers panel as a keyframe. So let's do an example with a new one. So let's create a new folder here. This is going to be folder number 11. I'm just going to fill it with whatever layers I have in there. And you can go down to the timeline. You can click on this button near the bottom here with this chain link, which is used to assign cells to frame. We're going to choose that new 11 folder. And you can see that new folder now acts as its own keyframe. And so I can have a scribble on this top line for that. I can have a scribble in red. I can have a scribble in blue. And then let's say I don't want the blue. I can just disable that, and then you can see that it acts as its own single keyframe on the timeline. Now if I go to the right, click on this button here, which is create a new animation cell, you can see that the next cell that's created, which is number 12, has the same folder structure as the previous one. And you can already see where this is going and what the potential is. Instead of drawing everything on a single cell, you can create a folder folder structure inside your animation folder. So for me, typically, I have my top layer as the black line art. You can see that right there. The middle layer is for flat colors, and the bottom layer is for my highlights and shadows. So the red lines and the blue lines, which are standard anime coloring lines. But yeah, to summarize, you can set an entire folder as a keyframe, and then when you duplicate it or create a new keyframe, it automatically creates that same layer structure for you every single time. You don't have to manually recreate your layers for every new drawing, it just does it automatically. This alone saves me so much time because I used to sit there creating new layers and renaming things over and over again for every single frame, and I know a lot of you are probably doing the same thing right now. And by the way, if you want to see how I set up my full layer structure for anime style coloring, I have another video that goes way deeper on this. I'll put a card in the corner right now. Okay, so now you've got your animation folder set up properly, but what happens when you need to actually move frames around on the timeline? This is where things get a little bit tricky. The second thing that nobody tells you is how to copy and paste frames. And I know that sounds basic, but here's the problem. It doesn't work the same way in the animation timeline. Like, you can't just hit Control-C and Control-V like you would in literally any other program. The copy and paste functions for the timeline frames are buried in the animation menu, and unless you've actively gone in and mapped them to a shortcut, you would never know that they exist. So let's say I want to copy keyframe number 2 and paste it somewhere in the middle of the timeline. Trying to do Control-C and Control-V just does not work. So what you need to do is make sure that you have that specific keyframe selected. You'll see that there is a red line that appears when you click on it. Go over to the top and click on Animation. Go to Edit Track, and you can see you have a copy, cut, and paste function right here in this menu. So I'm going to hit Copy. I'm going to move somewhere to here, like frame 17. I'm going to physically click into the timeline right there. I'm going to go back to Animation, Edit Track, and you can see that Paste is enabled. I'm going to hit Paste, and you can see that the frame gets pasted right where you selected. There's actually another secret menu that a lot of people didn't know existed, and this is the one that I personally use a lot more. So once again, we're going to select our keyframe, and we're going to click on this little, I don't know exactly what to call it, a hamburger menu or 3 horizontal lines next to the timeline, and you can see that there is an edit track function here, and again, you have cut, copy, and paste. Once again, copy, move over here, paste. So I highly recommend mapping these to a specific keyboard shortcut, because if you are someone like me who constantly is assigning and unassigning frames on the animation timeline, you're going to be using them constantly. To map a keyframe, all you do is go up to the top menu, click on Shortcut Settings, and then you'll be able to map any shortcut that you want. The other thing that trips people up is extending frames. So let's say I have a frame that is only being exposed for one frame. So we're going to zoom in here just to kind of give you an example. So let's say that we have a drawing that's only showing for one frame, but I want it to hold for a little bit longer. You don't have to copy and paste it a bunch of times. You can just grab the edge of one of these frames and drag it out onto the timeline. So now frame 3 is being held for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 frames. Now, for me, in particular, anime is usually animated on 2s and 3s, so I typically have these frames held for 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and so on and so forth. And obviously this works in reverse too. So let's say that this frame that's being held for 3 frames is held for too long. So all I gotta do is grab the edge and just drag it over, and you can see that it's now held for 2 frames. And you can see that it's pretty intuitive once you know what you're doing. Once I figured this out, I stopped fighting with the timeline and it actually started working for me. Alright, so now you can set up your folders properly and can actually manipulate frames on the timeline, but how do you keep everything organized, especially on longer projects? That's where these next features come in. The third point that I want to talk about is something that people seem to not even know even exists, and I'm talking about timeline markers, track labels, and in-between labels. So let's start with timeline markers. These are essentially little flags that you can place anywhere on your timeline to mark important spots. So For instance, let's say that we have this long hold here, and I want to actually specify in the animation file that this is a long hold. Basically, all I need to do is make sure that my playhead is placed exactly where I want it to be. Go into the hamburger menu here, click on label, and you'll see the option to create timeline label alongside all of these other things. So I'm gonna hit create timeline label. It's gonna give me the option to name it. So we're going to say long hold and hit OK. And now you can see there's a little flag here at the point where I had my playhead that says long hold. And you can basically use this to mark and label anything that you want on the timeline. And so let's say that we're going to have this point be the point that she starts moving again. So again, go here, label, timeline label, start moving. Great. Now it's all labeled. And again, you can map this to a keyboard shortcut or to a controller button, and that way you don't have to click into the menus to find what you need. So the next thing is track labels. So let's say that I want to label this something different. Let's say that this was labeled as B, but I wanted to actually name it as Serenity without having to rename it. So I have my actual folder selected, click on the hamburger menu, click on label, and create track label. And we're going to name this Serenity Sitting. We're going to hit OK. You can see that the actual track here is labeled. Again, this is just another option that you can have to label things in a way that is easier to see on the timeline itself. So let's go over here. Once again, hamburger menu, label, track label. I'm going to say test. And you can see that the flag itself is placed on the timeline and not just hovering over the entire thing. So this works especially well if you're doing something like storing things inside of folders and you don't want to have the labels cluttered up. You can expand it and see them on the track there. And overall, none of these features change how your animation actually looks. These are purely organizational. But trust me, once your project gets past like 50 frames, you're gonna want these. We're gonna delete those. And the last feature or the last type of label is something that not a lot of people use, but is something that I personally use in my animation workflow. And that is the in-between markers. So there are these two circle markers that actually get placed directly on the timeline itself. So this is what one of them looks like. This is the solid circle, and this is the hollow circle. So this is similar to the track label where you can place them directly on the timeline, but the thing that this is mostly used is in anime or animation where you're doing like tie downs and in-betweens. And essentially it's just placeholders that you can put on the timeline in order to mark where you're going to be drawing an in-between frame. Again, I have other videos that explain more about what in-betweens are or why they use them, but basically you have a whole bunch of different options for different types of labels, organizational stuff, and just a lot of different ways to make sure that you don't lose track of things in your animation file. The fourth thing we're going to be talking about is transform keyframes. And I'm not talking about the 2D camera within CSP. That's an entirely separate and more complicated topic. I'm talking about the ability to animate a layer's position, scale, and rotation over time using keyframes, pretty much exactly like you would in video editing software. This means that you can take a finished drawing and, without redrawing anything, animate it moving across the screen, or rotating, or scaling up and down. Essentially, you have a layer selected, enable keyframes on the layer by clicking on this button here, and then you just start adding keyframes. So I can have my playhead at the beginning, press this button here, move down the timeline, move the layer over, and you can see that it's automatically creating position keyframes everywhere that I'm moving it in time and space. I believe the term that a lot of people use is tweening for this type of technique. This is basically just animating like you would in a video editing software. And I constantly use this for small elements, like if I have a background element that needs to drift slowly or a character that needs to slide into frame. I don't have to draw every single frame of that movement. I just set the keyframes and let the software handle it. So to give an example with my own animation, I'm going to expand this here. You can actually see, as I show you the timeline, that I've got a few keyframes on the cloud icon. And when I scrub through the timeline, you can see that the cloud just lazily drifts up and down in a looping motion. Now, this is something that I normally would have done in a video editing software, but because the option is available to me in CSP, I decided to go with it here because it saves me a bunch of time later on in the process. Is this a replacement for actual animation? No, but it does save me time, and this does mean that in Clip Studio Paint, I can do a lot of the compositing work right here in the same program rather than having to export everything to After Effects or DaVinci Resolve. A lot of people think that Clip Studio is just for drawing frames, but it can actually handle way more than that. So yeah, those are some major tips about the Clip Studio Paint animation timeline that I wish someone had told me years ago. Animation folders and how to actually use them, copy, paste, extending frames, timeline markers and labels for organization, and transform keyframes for movement without redrawing. Once I understood these, the timeline stopped being this confusing mess and started being something that I could actually work with. And hopefully this helps you to get there faster than I did. And if you want to see how I set up my entire Clip Studio workspace for animation on the iPad, check out the video on screen now. I go through my full setup, shortcuts, and everything that I use to animate on the go. Thanks for visiting the Mind Palace, and I'll see you all in the next video.